As you know, the brain is the master computer of the body, and there can be serious implications when one or more parts of the brain are damaged. It makes sense that there should be several methods for protecting this essential and delicate organ. In this video, we'll talk briefly about the three primary methods of protecting the brain. Your objective for this video is to describe the three protective barriers protecting the brain. So, the three methods of protecting the brain, I know, I've said it several times now. You know there are three. It'll be the meninges, the cerebral spinal fluid, and the blood-brain barrier. The meninges are thin membranes that cover and protect the brain and spinal cord. They support blood vessels and enclose venous sinuses. They also contain the cerebral spinal fluid. As you can see from this image, there are three meninges. This is the bone of the skull, and then just deep to that we have the first meninx. This is the dura mater. Deep to that is the arachnoid mater, and deep to that is the pia mater. The dura mater, or hard mother, represented by the white film that you see surrounding the cranial cavity here, consists of two layers. You have the periosteal layer, which fuses the dura mater to the skull, and then you have the meningeal layer, which is the true outer layer of the brain. In certain places, the dura mater extends inward to form partitions that divide the cranial cavity. This dura mater in its arrangement helps to limit excessive movement of the brain within the skull. The two layers of the dura mater are mostly fused, but they separate in certain areas to form dural sinuses, like these. The dural venous sinuses lie between the periosteal and meningeal layers of the dura mater, and they're thought of as collecting pools of blood, which drain the central nervous system, the face, and the scalp. All of the dural venous sinuses drain into the internal jugular vein. The middle meninx is called the arachnoid mater. It gets this name because arachnoid refers to spiders, and this meninx has spider web-like extensions. It's separated from the dura mater by a subdural space. The subarachnoid space contains cerebral spinal fluid and the largest blood vessels of the brain. Modifications of the arachnoid mater protrude through the dura mater into the superior sagittal sinus. This permits the reabsorption of cerebral spinal fluid back into the venous blood. You can't see that here, but if you wanted to, you could look it up in another figure. The pia mater, or little mother, is a delicate layer of connective tissue that clings tightly to the brain, and it follows every single convolution. It contains many tiny blood vessels that feed the brain. And I just want to add here, because I didn't say it specifically, but all of the meninges are composed of connective tissue. So sometimes, due to injuries from blunt force trauma, a fall, or another impact, there can be intracranial bleeding. The epidural space, so this is a space that's between the dura mater and the skull, it can collect blood. If hemorrhaging occurs here, it will press on the dura mater, but it may not damage the brain because the dura mater, like its name, it's pretty tough and it can resist force, but there will be pressure. The subdural space is the space between the dura mater and the brain. And if blood collects here, there may be brain damage. It can result from the direct pressure onto the brain because the blood doesn't have anywhere to go. It's basically trapped between this hard tissue, that's the dura mater, and a softer tissue, which is the brain. Deep to the arachnoid space, arachnoid mater, you have the arachnoid space right here. And it's between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, and all of your blood vessels and cranial nerves have to pass through this space. Bleeding here can definitely cause brain damage and nerve damage. A disorder that's associated with the meninges is meningitis. This is inflammation of the meninges, and it's typically caused by some sort of microorganism that is causing an infection around the brain, like a virus or a bacterium. You've probably heard of bacterial and viral meningitis. There's also fungal, parasitic causes. And sometimes you do have non-infectious causes. So, for example, maybe someone gets exposed to a medication or a poison, and it causes inflammation. Meningitis can spread to the central nervous system, which could lead to inflammation of the brain, which is called encephalitis. Typically, meningitis is observed by finding microorganisms in a sample of cerebral spinal fluid obtained by a lumbar puncture. The ventricles are a series of connected cavities in the brain, and they're highlighted in blue here. These cavities are filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and the largest ones are right here. These are called the lateral ventricles. Then you have the third ventricle here, right around the thalamus. And then you have the fourth ventricle here, right by the cerebellum. And then there's a little passageway that connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. It's called the cerebral aqueduct. Okay. So the ventricles help to cushion the brain and make it less dense so it doesn't collapse upon itself. It also brings nutrients to the brain and carries away waste. So the cerebral spinal fluid in the ventricles is a filtrate of the blood. So the glucose that the neurons need to survive, along with any vitamins, get to the brain through the cerebral spinal fluid. Some medications and toxins also get to the brain via the cerebral spinal fluid as well. The fluid not only fills the ventricles inside of the brain, but it also surrounds the brain and bathes the brain surface and spinal cord, and it bathes the spinal cord as well. A study that came out in 2018, I believe, showed that when we sleep, if we sleep long enough, the cerebral spinal fluid is actually flowed through the brain in waves that seem to match waves that go through our brain when we sleep. And it's thought that the cerebral spinal fluid helps to cleanse the brain. This is a reason why sleep is so important. It helps wash away misfolded proteins and wastes. So interestingly, the study that came out suggested that people who have Alzheimer's and dementia and they have certain neurodegenerative diseases, it may in part be because they don't sleep well. There seems to be a correlation, for example, between Alzheimer's and not sleeping well. And the thought is, since these patients don't sleep so well, perhaps the cerebral spinal fluid doesn't have a chance to wash the misfolded proteins out of the brain, and so they form these accumulations called plaques and kill neurons, basically. This hasn't been determined yet. This is just an association, not a correlation. So, a little bit of interesting information about cerebral spinal fluid that's worth knowing. And if you're not doing it, you need to get more sleep. Especially now that we know that your brain goes through a wash cycle while you're sleeping. Your third system that protects the brain is the blood-brain barrier. It helps to maintain a constant internal environment for the brain. Substances that are in the blood have to pass through 3 layers of membrane and cells, and this is going to filter the blood so that nutrients can diffuse into the central nervous system, and wastes, most drugs, proteins, toxins, they're all kept out. Now, it's not effective against everything. For example, some of your lipid-soluble toxins are not kept out by the blood-brain barrier because those toxins can diffuse through the membranes that make up this barrier. Gases also can diffuse straight through, so it's ineffective against gases as well. Now, the blood-brain barrier isn't completely uniform. In some areas it's absent, or the blood vessels are quite permeable. For example, down around the hypothalamus you have the vomiting center of the brainstem, and it is not covered by the blood-brain barrier. This allows that area of the brain to kind of sample the blood, basically, and toxins and things that might be in the blood can trigger or stimulate that area, causing vomiting to get rid of the toxins. So this is kind of what the blood-brain barrier looks like. We have a capillary which is carrying blood, and this is a very small capillary. Notice that in a normal capillary there are intercellular spaces, so this means that molecules and cells can diffuse out of the blood into the tissues, and vice versa. So you have those. Sometimes you have fenestrations, which are like a larger gap between cells. You also only have one layer of cells. These are endothelial cells. That's the type of epithelial cell that makes up the capillary wall. In the blood-brain barrier, you have something more like this. So instead of having fenestrations and intercellular spaces, you have tight junctions, which basically seal the membranes of adjacent cells. So this closes up those spaces so that molecules and cells can't traverse the capillary wall as easily. They have to actually diffuse through a cell. In addition to that, you have pericytes. This is a cell that is sometimes just outside of, it surrounds the capillary. So anything that's in the blood has to diffuse not only through the endothelial cell, but it also has to go through the pericyte. Then on top of that, you have astrocytes. Remember, these are astroglial cells. Remember, these are cells that, these are cells that have a kind of star-shaped appearance, and they have processes that can wrap around capillaries. So that's what's going on here. So that means not only does something in the blood have to diffuse through the endothelial cells, the pericytes, but it also has to diffuse through the astrocyte. So all of these layers help to protect the neurons from toxic substances that might be in the blood. So that's it for this video. Those are the 3 protective barriers protecting the brain. You have the meninges, or the meninges rather, that form 3 connective tissue layers that cover the surface of the brain. You have the ventricles and cerebral spinal fluid, and you have the blood-brain barrier. If you have any questions about this video or any of my other videos, please don't hesitate to reach out by email, text, or come by office hours and we can talk about it. Good luck with your studying. I'll see you at the next video.